Celeste Whitmore set the envelope against my chest like she was handing down a verdict from a bench only she could see. 3 days, she told my mother and my sister, standing on our own porch with a security guard at her shoulder for effect. Get your whole family out of Briar Glen, or the association will have you removed. Then she looked at my boots, dusty from the truck, and asked what exactly a man like me thought he was going to do about it. I read the forged signature at the bottom of that notice, checked my watch, and handed the envelope back to her without raising my voice. You're right about one thing, Celeste. Someone is leaving Briar Glen today. You just don't have 3 days. You have 3 hours. The porch light was still on from the night before, burning uselessly in the morning sun when Celeste Whitmore climbed our steps with a folder pressed against her hip like a weapon she'd rehearsed drawing. She had brought a security officer named Curtis and a board member whose name I never bothered to learn, because I understood immediately this was not a private conversation. This was theater, staged for the neighbors already peering through blinds up and down Cardinal Way. She wanted an audience for the moment she broke my family, the way some people need a mirror to enjoy their own cruelty. I remember the smell of cut grass drifting over from the Hendersons' yard, and the way the metal porch rail was already warm under my palm even though it was barely past 9 in the morning. Celeste wore a cream blazer that never seemed to wrinkle no matter how long she stood lecturing someone, and she held that folder the way a prosecutor holds a closing argument, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere upstream of this conversation, and she was only here to read the verdict aloud. Curtis stood a step behind her, hands folded, clearly uncomfortable with whatever role he'd been assigned that morning. The board member beside him kept glancing at his shoes, and I understood even then that he hadn't fully agreed to be part of this, only that he hadn't found courage to say so. The notice claimed our house was harboring multiple unauthorized households, a phrase that would have been laughable if it weren't also the hinge on which she intended to swing us out of our own home. My mother Elaine, my sister Marlo, and I are blood, not tenants, not squatters, not some patchwork of strangers splitting rent. Celeste knew that. She said it anyway, because facts were never the point of the notice. The point was humiliation delivered with a deadline attached. She turned her attention to me the way a woman turns towards something she's already decided to be disgusted by. She asked why a man pushing 40 was still living under his mother's roof. She suggested, loud enough for the Hendersons 2 doors down to hear, that it was probably my sister paying the electric bill, the property taxes, keeping the lights on for a grown man who couldn't manage his own life. She looked at the grease still ringed under my fingernails from working on the truck the night before and called it proof I was good for nothing but odd jobs. Men like you, she said, with a little laugh she clearly enjoyed, always get loud because you've got nothing else to stand on. I didn't argue with any of it. I've learned that people who need an audience for their contempt rarely want a debate. They want a performance, and refusing to perform is its own kind of answer. Instead, I read the notice twice, slowly, the way my father taught me to read anything with his name still technically attached to it. 3 things jumped out before I'd even reached the second paragraph. The section she cited didn't exist anywhere in the current governing documents. The association had no authority to order a homeowner removed from private property in 72 hours, full stop. And the signature at the bottom, credited to board member Grant Holloway, had the flat, lifeless uniformity of something that had been lifted and pasted rather than written by a hand holding a pen. I looked at my watch, an old steel thing that used to belong to my father, and told Celeste she had exactly 3 hours to find new employment. She laughed in front of the Hendersons, in front of Curtis, in front of my mother and my sister, certain I was some unemployed man play-acting at authority to save face on his own porch. She had no idea how close to true that clock actually was. When she finally turned to leave, her heels clicking down our front steps like punctuation. I flipped the envelope over out of habit, the way you check the back of anything before you throw it away. There was a file number stamped faintly in the corner, one my father had circled in red ink years earlier on a folder he kept locked, with a note beside it that I would not fully understand until that afternoon. My mother Elaine didn't say a word until Celeste's car had pulled off Cardinal Way. She has never been the kind of woman who needs to fill silence with panic. She simply stood there, arms crossed, watching the taillights disappear, and then she asked me quietly whether I remembered the number on that envelope. I told her I didn't, not yet, but that I intended to. My sister Marlo was already on her phone, screenshotting the notice before Celeste could quietly disappear it from whatever system had generated it, because Marlo has never trusted a threat that arrives without a paper trail attached. I should explain why Celeste chose my family, out of every household in Briar Glen, to make an example of. It wasn't sudden. It had been building for 6 months, ever since I moved back in after my father passed, back into the house I grew up in, back into a bedroom that still had his handwriting on the inside of the closet door, where he used to mark my height as a boy. Celeste fined my truck twice for parking in a spot I was legally entitled to use. She sent a warning because my tools sat on the porch for 2 hours while I fixed a hinge. She demanded Marlo register as a tenant, despite being Elaine's own daughter, born in this house, raised in this house, with every legal right to be in it. She photographed me trimming the hedges and, in an email to the board, described me as unlicensed labor operating without authorization, as if pruning my own mother's boxwoods required a permit from the state. At one HOA meeting I attended in the spring, I asked a simple procedural question about how reserve funds were being allocated. Celeste looked past me entirely and asked if someone who actually owned property could repeat the question, as though my presence in the room were an inconvenience she was choosing to tolerate rather than a right I held by blood and by law. Her contempt for me was never just personal irritation. It ran on an assumption, one she seemed to hold with real conviction, that a man living with his mother and sister could not possibly be the one making decisions in that household, and therefore could not possibly be a threat worth taking seriously. There was another meeting, back in early winter, where she interrupted me twice in the span of a single sentence, then apologized sweetly to the room for the delay, as if my speaking at all had been the interruption. She once sent an email to the entire board, suggesting my presence at community events made certain residents uncomfortable, without ever naming a single resident who had actually complained. She had a habit of addressing every question I raised to whichever woman happened to be sitting nearest me, as though my voice were simply background noise that needed a translator. I noticed the pattern long before that morning on the porch, and I chose, for months, to let it slide off me rather than escalate a fight over something as small as being ignored in a folding chair once a month. What I hadn't accounted for was how much that restraint would embolden her. Looking back, I think my silence read to Celeste as confirmation of everything she already believed about me, that I had nothing behind me worth defending, no leverage, no standing, nothing but a quiet temper she assumed would eventually crack under enough pressure. She mistook patience for weakness, which is a mistake people who rely on intimidation make more often than they'd like to admit. I told my mother and sister some of my history that morning, though not all of it. I used to work as a contract auditor, the kind of job that trains you to read a document the way other people read a room, looking for the places where the language doesn't quite match the intent behind it. What I hadn't told them, because I hadn't wanted to lean on it, was the full weight of what I inherited when my father died. There is an entity called Rourke Land Trust, and after his death, I became its legal successor. I had not used that inheritance for anything beyond quiet paperwork in the months since. I didn't see the need to swing something that large at parking tickets, and passive-aggressive emails. My mother recognized the file number on the back of that envelope the moment I read it aloud to her. She went inside without a word and came back holding a small brass key, one she'd kept in a drawer since my father's funeral, one that belonged to a locked filing cabinet in his old study that none of us had opened since he passed. She said only one thing as she pressed it into my palm. "Your father told me never to open that cabinet unless someone came for Gate 6. I didn't know what Gate 6 meant yet, but I understood, standing there on the porch with Celeste's taillights long gone, that whatever answer was waiting in that cabinet mattered more than any fine she'd ever issued us. Inside that cabinet, beneath a layer of dust that told me my father hadn't opened it in years either, I found a folded development map showing Briar Glen's 4 planned phases, a copy of the HOA's management contract, a succession document with my own name typed cleanly onto the final page, and a single handwritten note in my father's blocky print. "Never surrender Gate 6, it read. "Whoever controls it controls Phase 4. I sat at his old desk and unfolded the map, tracing the access road that ran directly along the side of our property, the only road wide enough and legal enough to reach the undeveloped final phase of the neighborhood. Gate 6 sat almost on top of our driveway, and Celeste, I now understood, hadn't come for a parking violation. She had come for the road. The desk chair still creaked exactly the way it had when I was a teenager, sneaking in to borrow tape or scissors while my father worked late over blueprints spread across that same surface. He used to tell me that most disputes over land aren't really about the land at all. They're about who controls the one narrow passage everyone else needs to get anywhere useful, and whoever holds that passage holds the leverage, whether or not they ever build a single thing on it. I hadn't thought about that lesson in years, not until I was sitting in his chair reading his handwriting and realizing exactly what he'd meant. I called Marlo into the study and spread the map flat across the desk so she could see it too. She traced the line of Gate 6 with one finger, following it from our property line out toward the undeveloped acreage beyond the tree break at the edge of the neighborhood. And she said, quietly, that this explained more than 6 months of petty harassment ever could. Nobody spends that much energy chasing a man over a parking spot. People spend that kind of energy when there's real money sitting on the other side of a locked gate. With just under 2 hours and 40 minutes left on the clock I'd set for her, I called Laurel Dane, the attorney who has handled Rourke Land Trust matters since before my father passed. I forwarded her a photo of the notice within minutes. Laurel confirmed almost immediately what I already suspected, that this was not a lawful eviction order of any kind, only a threat dressed up in the costume of one, built to look official enough that a frightened family might not question it before packing their bags. But Laurel was careful to warn me that scaring off a bluff and actually ending Celeste's employment in 3 hours were 2 very different problems, and the second one would require proof of 3 specific things. Celeste had to have known she lacked the authority to issue that notice. She had to have used forged or falsified documentation to do it, and her actions had to trace back to a personal financial interest or a clear breach of her employment contract, not simply overzealous enforcement of community rules. Marlo, working from the kitchen table with her laptop open, pulled up the county's public development portal and found a new permit application filed only weeks earlier. It requested access rights along the very driveway beside our house, granting a developer legal passage straight through land my family controlled. According to the application, the Rourke family had already consented in writing. I had never signed any such consent. When Marlo zoomed in on the signature page, the handwriting looked disturbingly close to my father's, a man who had been dead for over a year and therefore could not have signed anything dated 3 months ago. That single discovery reframed everything. Celeste wasn't simply a difficult board president enforcing petty rules out of some misplaced sense of order. She needed either our house or, more precisely, the access rights that ran alongside it to complete some larger arrangement, one lucrative enough that she was willing to forge documents and threaten an entire family with removal to get it. I spent the next few minutes sending a formal evidence preservation notice to every relevant party I could think of. It went to the full HOA board, to Sterling Crest Management, to the association's retained counsel, and to the development company itself, instructing all of them not to delete a single email, meeting record, or piece of camera footage related to our property or to the notice she'd issued that morning. Less than 5 minutes after I hit send on that notice, Celeste fired back with a mass email to the entire neighborhood, one that called my family occupiers, attempting to sabotage the community, language chosen for exactly the kind of panic it produced. Neighbors who had known us for years began texting my mother, asking if it was true, if we were somehow squatting in a house we'd owned for 3 decades. It was an ugly, calculated move, meant to poison the well of public opinion before anyone had a chance to see the actual documents. I understood then that Celeste realized I wasn't bluffing, and that realization had made her dangerous in a different way. Within that first hour, she escalated far beyond a mass email. She deactivated the gate access cards for our entire household, cutting off the simplest way in and out of our own neighborhood. She had orange violation notices plastered across our front door for the entire street to see. She ordered the security staff to photograph every vehicle registered to our address, building what looked disturbingly like a case file. She pushed out a community newsletter framing the association as protecting residents from what she called a household exhibiting threatening behavior, a phrase engineered to make us sound dangerous rather than simply inconvenient to her plans. And she scheduled an emergency board meeting for that same afternoon, one clearly designed to rubber stamp a decision she had already made hours earlier, rather than to actually deliberate anything. She called me directly not long after that, her voice sharpened into something almost gleeful. "You should use those 3 hours packing boxes," she said. "Men without jobs love to imagine they're lawyers." I didn't answer with anger, because anger was exactly what she wanted from me, evidence for whatever narrative she was already building about a threatening, unstable man. Instead, I asked her a simple question. I asked her to read me the names of every board member who had voted to approve that morning's notice. She refused, and the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Grant Holloway called me quietly. Less than 10 minutes later, his voice low, almost apologetic, the voice of a man who knows he should have spoken up months earlier. He confirmed there had never been a vote authorizing that notice. The signature on it, credited to him, was not one he had written. He admitted he'd stayed silent for months because Celeste controlled the association's financial records, and he worried that any accusation against her might somehow implicate him too, tangled as his own name apparently was in paperwork he'd never actually reviewed. I forwarded everything I had gathered so far to Avery Sloan, the regional director at Sterling Crest Management, the company that technically employed Celeste as community director. Avery's response was cautious, professional, non-committal. He said the company would review the matter, but that I would need to demonstrate the trust's authority was still legally valid, because Celeste had already filed a resolution the year before claiming that authority had lapsed entirely. That resolution turned out to be the single greatest obstacle standing between me and the truth. When Laurel pulled it up and read it aloud over the phone, I felt something cold settle in my chest, because the signature at the bottom of that resolution, the one supposedly ending my family's authority over the land, was credited to me. It was a signature I had never written, on a document I had never seen, dated at a moment I could prove I wasn't even in the state. With roughly 1 hour and 50 minutes remaining, Laurel and I began tearing that resolution apart line by line. The date on the signature page fell during the exact week I had been out of state handling my father's funeral arrangements, a fact easily verified through flight records and funeral home paperwork. The notary listed on the document had let her commission expire months before the date printed on the page, meaning she legally could not have notarized anything that day. The meeting minutes claimed to have taken place in the clubhouse on a date when, according to the maintenance log, the entire building had been closed for electrical repairs. There was no camera footage, no room booking record, no meeting invitation sent to anyone, corroborating that any such gathering had occurred. Grant and Naomi were both listed as present at that phantom meeting, despite neither of them ever having attended it. I drove to the county records office, not far from Briar Glen, to pull a certified copy of the succession documentation naming me as the legal representative of Rourke Land Trust. The building smelled the way every records office seems to smell, like old paper and floor wax, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I waited at the counter. A records clerk named Ellis Boone pulled the file without much urgency at first, the way someone handles a routine request, until he noticed the name on the folder and glanced up at me with a different kind of attention entirely. He confirmed within minutes that my authority remained fully valid, untouched by whatever fiction Celeste had constructed. He printed a certified copy, stamped it, and slid it across the counter, and then he mentioned something almost in passing that hit me harder than anything else that day. Celeste herself had requested a copy of that exact same succession file 2 months earlier, walking through these same doors, standing at this same counter, reading the same document I was holding now. She had known from the beginning who I was and what I controlled. Her contempt for me on the porch that morning hadn't come from ignorance. It had come from calculation, a bet that humiliation and pressure would push me out the door before I ever thought to check what power I actually held. I asked Ellis if he remembered anything else about that visit, and he thought about it for a moment before telling me she'd seemed disappointed by what she found, as if she'd been hoping the succession had lapsed or gone unclaimed. Instead, she'd learned that a man she'd never met, a man she would later mock on his own porch for wearing dusty boots, held the one piece of authority capable of undoing everything she was quietly building toward. That single detail told me more about her plan than any forged signature could have. She hadn't stumbled into this. She had scouted at first, decided I was the weak point in the way, and built her entire timeline around removing me before I noticed. I sent the certified documentation straight to Avery and cited a specific clause in the management contract, one stating clearly that a community director could be suspended immediately upon evidence of using falsified records to coerce a homeowner. Celeste, apparently anticipating exactly this, had the board meeting room locked when I arrived that afternoon, telling the front desk staff I wasn't permitted inside. When I walked up anyway, folder in hand, she glanced at the documents I was carrying and said, with real disdain, that men like me inherited a few pieces of paper and immediately convinced themselves they held real power. I told her those few pieces of paper were the exact thing that had given her whatever power she was currently standing on. She answered that she had one final document, one she claimed would render everything I'd built completely meaningless, and she said it with enough confidence that for a moment I wondered if I'd missed something. She produced a set of board meeting minutes claiming the entire board had voted to strip Rourke Land Trust of its authority and approve the new development permit in its place. This time, though, I had already prepared for exactly this kind of move. Grant looked at his own supposed signature and confirmed publicly, in front of several residents who had gathered by then, that it had been lifted from an older, unrelated document. Naomi Kessler recognized the same forgery pattern in her own signature line. Marlowe compared fonts, line spacing, and the file's metadata against every other official document the association had produced that year. and found the file had actually been created nearly 3 weeks after the date printed at the top of the page. Naomi, the association's treasurer, opened the payment ledger while we stood there and found something that finally connected every thread. The HOA had transferred $86,400 to an entity called Northvale Civic Partners, logged under the vague heading of Community Redevelopment Research. Northvale Civic Partners, it turned out, had no listed employees, was registered to a rented mailbox across the county line, and connected directly back to a consulting firm quietly owned in part by Celeste herself. Documents Naomi pulled showed Northvale stood to receive an additional payment if the Phase 4 permit was approved, a payment tied directly to whether that access road beside our house ever got built. Buried in the same ledger was another line item, $18,000, labeled simply as a resident relocation fund. My family was listed as the very first household intended to be relocated using that money, months before Celeste ever set foot on our porch with that envelope. Naomi's hands were shaking slightly as she read the figures aloud, not from fear but from something closer to disbelief. The particular unsteadiness of someone realizing they'd been signing off on budgets for months without ever questioning where the money actually went. She told me later she'd trusted Celeste completely for nearly 3 years, had defended her more than once when other residents grumbled about strict enforcement, and that discovering the truth felt less like catching a stranger in a lie and more like watching a friend's face rearrange itself into someone she'd never actually met. Furious at how quickly the room had turned against her, Celeste ordered the security staff to remove me from the clubhouse entirely. The officer on duty refused, after Laurel forwarded him the property records and an official notice of the ongoing dispute, making clear that removing me would expose the association to significant liability. Standing in front of neighbors who had by then pulled out their phones, Celeste finally lost the composure she'd worn like armor all morning. "Your mother owns the house," she snapped at me. "Your sister pays the bills. You're just a man out here playing at being in charge." I held up Elaine's notarized power of attorney and the certified successor documentation together, side by side, and let the room see them for themselves. "You spent 6 months deciding who I was," I told her. "You never once spent 6 minutes checking." Almost immediately after that exchange, Avery Sloan announced an emergency review meeting would begin in 15 minutes, combining Sterling Crest's oversight authority with the board's own procedures. My watch showed 55 minutes remaining on the window I'd given her that morning. That meeting ran as a hybrid, part of the board, and several residents gathered in the clubhouse, Avery and Laurel joining by video from their respective offices. The room felt smaller than usual, the folding chairs arranged in tighter rows than I remembered from any prior meeting, and the projector screen at the front still displayed the association's logo, waiting for someone to load an agenda that had clearly been rewritten more than once that afternoon. Celeste sat at the head table, with her hands folded in front of her, composed in a way that almost looked convincing if you hadn't already seen the ledger Naomi was holding. Celeste fought to hold on to control of the room, even as it visibly slipped away from her. She muted my microphone twice, once claiming a technical issue and once not bothering to offer any excuse at all. She called the evidence being presented a personal vendetta rooted in resentment, insisting I had manufactured this entire confrontation because I resented a woman holding authority over me. She claimed I was threatening a woman in a position of leadership, attempting to twist a conversation about forged documents into a conversation about gender, hoping sympathy might do what facts no longer could. A few residents in the back row shifted uncomfortably, unsure yet which version of the story to believe, and I understood that the next several minutes would decide which way that uncertainty broke. I refused to let that framing take hold. I told the room plainly that this was never about her being a woman. It was about her using my mother and my sister as leverage to diminish me publicly, then using their names and mine on documents none of us had ever signed, all in service of a deal that would have paid her personally. I kept my voice level while I said it, because I understood that the moment I raised it even slightly, she would point to that instead of the ledger sitting open on the table in front of Naomi. One by one, the evidence went into the record in order, and I watched the room's mood shift with each new piece. Grant confirmed there had never been a vote to remove us, his voice unsteady but clear, and he apologized aloud to my mother for staying silent as long as he had. Naomi laid out the unapproved payments line by line, reading each figure slowly enough that nobody in the room could later claim they hadn't understood the scale of it. Laurel confirmed the Rourke Land Trust Authority remained fully intact, walking the board through the succession, filing with the calm precision of someone who has done this 100 times before and never once enjoyed it. Ellis, joining briefly by phone from the records office, confirmed the forged signature belonged to a man who had been dead for over a year, a detail that drew an audible gasp from somewhere near the back of the room. Avery confirmed Celeste remained, contractually, a salaried employee, bound by the very management agreement she'd been violating, and reminded everyone present that her authority as community director had never been unlimited, no matter how she'd chosen to wield it. Marlowe walked the room through the metadata, proving the meeting minutes had been fabricated weeks after the fact, pulling up timestamps on the projector screen so nobody would have to take her word for it. By the time the last piece of evidence had been read into the record, the silence in that room had changed character entirely. It was no longer the uncertain, waiting silence from 20 minutes earlier. It was the silence of people who had just watched a story collapse in real time and were quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the woman who had run their community for the past several years. Cornered, Celeste tried one last maneuver, claiming Rourke Land Trust owed unpaid association dues, which she said had automatically suspended our voting rights months earlier. Laurel had the bank records and payment receipts ready within seconds, showing the supposed debt had only appeared after Celeste personally entered a penalty fee the board had never approved or even discussed. With 12 minutes left on my internal clock, she tried to adjourn the meeting outright. With 8 minutes left, she logged into the shared system and began deleting emails from the association account. With 6 minutes left, the technology team at Sterling Crest locked her out entirely and preserved every log on the server before she could finish. Avery asked her one final, simple question. If she truly hadn't known about my authority over the trust, why had she personally requested those succession records 2 months before issuing the eviction notice? Celeste opened her mouth twice and produced no answer either time. The silence stretched long enough that everyone in that room understood exactly what it meant, and I watched something behind her eyes finally give way, the same certainty that had let her mock me on my own porch, that morning collapsing under the weight of everything now sitting in the record. When the clock I'd set for her that morning finally ran out, Avery delivered Sterling Crest's decision without hesitation. The company terminated Celeste's employment immediately, citing the forged minutes and resolutions, the unauthorized eviction notice, the concealed financial conflict of interest, the misuse of association data for personal gain, and her attempt to destroy records in the middle of an active investigation. She lost the salaried position that had given her both income and standing in the community within the same breath. Grant moved immediately to remove her from her elected role as board president as well, and Naomi seconded it without hesitation. The vote followed proper procedure and passed cleanly, stripping her of every remaining title she'd held that morning. The board's retained counsel confirmed the 3-day notice was void from the moment it was issued, that every fine levied against my family would be reversed. that the Phase 4 permit application was suspended indefinitely, that an independent audit of association finances would begin within the week, and that the forged documents themselves would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for further review. Celeste turned to me and asked, almost involuntarily, who I actually was. I didn't tell her I was wealthy or powerful or secretly important in some way she should have guessed. I told her only that I was the man she had decided wasn't worth checking on. I glanced at my watch. The 3 hours had passed exactly as I'd told her they would that morning. You gave my family 3 days because you assumed we had nowhere left to go, I said. I gave you 3 hours because I already knew exactly where the evidence was sitting. She left the clubhouse carrying a small box of her belongings, and nobody touched her, nobody cheered, nobody said a single unkind word as she walked past. The silence in that room felt heavier than any insult could have, the particular kind of quiet that settles over a place when everyone finally understands exactly what happened and exactly why it happened that way. My mother reached for my hand as the door closed behind Celeste, and I felt how tightly she was holding it, tighter than she probably realized. Marlo let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding since the porch that morning, and for a moment none of us said anything at all. Just sat there in the folding chairs while the rest of the room slowly began gathering coats and bags around us. A few neighbors came by afterward, quietly, almost sheepishly, to apologize for the messages they'd sent earlier that day questioning whether we really belonged in the house we'd owned for 30 years. I didn't hold it against any of them. Fear moves fast when someone in authority tells you to be afraid, and it takes real courage to walk that fear back once you learn the truth. Grant lingered near the doorway longer than everyone else, and before he left he stopped in front of me and apologized again. This time more plainly than he had over the phone that morning. He said he should have questioned Celeste months earlier, the first time he noticed his own name on a document he didn't remember signing, and that his silence had cost my family a day of fear it never should have had to carry. I told him that recognizing it now, out loud, in front of the board, counted for something. Not everything, but something. In the weeks that followed, the independent audit uncovered even more unapproved payments than Naomi had found that afternoon, and Celeste ended up facing a civil suit from the association alongside a separate investigation into the forged records themselves. Sterling Crest brought in an interim director from outside the community, while Briar Glen prepared to hold new board elections under a revised set of rules. Every vote would now be recorded and made public. No single individual could issue an eviction notice without full board approval on record. Any contractor relationship involving a board member's personal financial interest would have to be disclosed before any vote was taken. Homeowners were guaranteed direct access to meeting minutes and financial records without having to request them through a gatekeeper. And the community newsletter could no longer be used to publicly disparage any resident under any circumstance. I turned down the chance to run for board president myself, because replacing one person who craved control with another person holding too much power never struck me as a real solution to anything. Rourke Land Trust retained ownership of Gate 6, but instead of selling that access to any developer, we agreed to convert the land into a walking path and a small green space the whole neighborhood could actually use, something my father would have approved of far more than another phase of construction. My family stayed exactly where we'd always been. My mother kept tending her garden along the back fence, the way she has for 30 years, and that autumn she planted a row of tulip bulbs along the walkway leading up to Gate 6. Saying she wanted something to bloom there instead of asphalt. My sister kept her work as a physical therapist, driving the same route to the same clinic every morning, though she started stopping by the clubhouse on her way home now and then, just to sit in on the open board sessions and make sure nobody quietly slid back into old habits. and I finally finished repairing the porch railing Celeste had once pointed to as proof I was some unemployed man drifting through his mother's house with nothing better to do. Word got around the neighborhood eventually about what Rourke Land Trust actually was, and about what I had quietly held the authority to do the entire time Celeste was fining me for parking in my own driveway. A few neighbors treated me differently after that, more deferential, almost embarrassed, and I found I didn't much care for that either. I wasn't interested in being feared any more than I'd been interested in being dismissed. I only wanted my mother's garden left alone, my sister's name kept out of paperwork that wasn't hers, and a road that stayed a walking path instead of becoming somebody's private shortcut to a payday. I framed that 3-day notice and hung it in my study, not as some trophy meant to gloat over, but as a quiet reminder for myself, something to glance at on mornings when I'm tempted to let a small unfairness slide, simply because confronting it feels exhausting. My father used to say that most people who abuse whatever power they're handed enjoy setting deadlines for everyone else, right up until the moment somebody finally starts counting down theirs instead. I think about that note he left in the filing cabinet more than I expected to, the one warning me never to surrender Gate 6, and I understand now that he wasn't only protecting a piece of land. He was protecting the idea that a family shouldn't have to prove its worth to anyone standing at the front door with a folder and a countdown. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit on that repaired porch railing and watch the last of the light fall across Cardinal Way, and I think about how close we came to losing all of it over a stranger's contempt and a stack of forged paper. Elaine still tells the story of that morning to anyone who asks, though she always ends it the same way, saying the real lesson wasn't about the road or the money or even Celeste at all. The real lesson, she says, is that quiet men keep records for a reason, and that the people who mistake silence for weakness are usually the ones who end up counting the fewest minutes of all.